Good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skyke, Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. No other country with so many novelties, How Mycology Went Global, with Brad Bolman. I've heard it reported recently that mushrooms are having a moment, and it certainly seems to be true. This August, the Lloyd Library opened in an exhibition a foray into fungi. The interest and response have been incredible. As we were curating this exhibition, we were lucky to have on site Brad Bolman, one of the Lloyd Library's 2023 fellows researching the history of mycology. Fascination with fungi is not new, but in the early 20th century, it went from a local endeavor to a global one. One of the participants at the center of the movement was our co-founder, Curtis Gates Lloyd. Tonight, we'll hear the intriguing story of mycology's transnational shift a little over 100 years ago. Our speaker, Brad Bolman, is a postdoctoral member of the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. His first book, The Dog Years, A History of Beagle Science, published by the University of Chicago Press, is due out next year. Brad is currently working on a second book, which explores the international history of mycology and fungal science. I also want to add that Brad was fun and fascinating to have spend a month with us at the Lloyd, and we learned a lot. It's our pleasure to introduce you to him tonight. Hi, Brad.
Hey. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and I'll go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen. And that should do it. Great. I just want to thank everybody for tuning in on this Wednesday evening. I'm really honored that you would choose to spend that time here. And I want to, before I get started, really thank the Lloyd Library and Museum for giving me this opportunity to have this fellowship. It was a really delightful time, and I learned so much, and I'm excited to share some of this work for my upcoming book, which emerged in some ways very directly from the summer research. So I'll go ahead and get going. So Cincinnati's Curtis Gates Lloyd, pictured left, was one of America's most prominent and controversial students of fungi, passed away in 1926. The next year, Joseph Rose, the Associate Curator of Plants for the U.S. Bureau of Plant Industry, visited Cincinnati, and he met with Lloyd's brother, John Urry, to discuss what would happen to Curtis's vast collection of dried fungi. Lloyd, Rose later wrote to his boss, has for many years devoted all of his time to the study of botany, especially the fleshy fungi, and has brought to Cincinnati from all parts of the world the greatest private herbarium of fungi to be found anywhere else. Rose added a telling anecdote, quote, "I remember once traveling in the wilds of Brazil, by accident meeting a priest who told me that he was collecting fungi for Mr. C.G. Lloyd of Cincinnati, Ohio." In my talk this evening, I want to explore how a project like Lloyd's could come into existence. So how could, and perhaps just as importantly, why would one man in Cincinnati try to collect fungus examples from really all over the world? As I'll try to show, Lloyd's project relied on, first, an expanding international mass communication infrastructure, second, on the extension, as well as to some extent the boredom of Western colonial officials around the world, and third, on a newfound and expanding sense of the extent of what we would today call world biodiversity, the idea that there's just so many different kinds of things out there. It's kind of a new idea. So we can start with just some basic background. For Curtis, Gates Lloyd was born in Kentucky in 1859. Like his brothers, he initially trained in pharmacy, but soon Curtis became fascinated less by pharmacy and more by botany and botanical collecting. Now, in doing so at this time, toward the end of the 19th century, he was one of many Americans to get pulled in by something of a fungus fad that took the country and some other countries by storm. And I just wanted to highlight at the start of this talk that there was a really wonderful lecture also at the Lloyd that's also available on YouTube, which goes into this fad in a little bit more detail. And I just wanted to highlight for those who are interested and may have missed this in a previous year, that this is a really wonderful talk and worth hearing. No, so Lloyd was serious in his hobby, and he found a local mentor in a mycologist in Centerville, Ohio, named Andrew Price Morgan. But soon after corresponding with Morgan, sending letters back and forth, Lloyd decided that he needed more extensive training. He needed a different kind of expert assistance. So he turned to two international experts, Narcisse Patouillard of France and Giacomo Bresadola of Italy. Despite the initial difference in mycological expertise, it's worth mentioning that the former was roughly Lloyd's age and Bresadola was only about 10 years older. Like Lloyd, Patouillard had practiced as a pharmacist for a number of years before turning later to mycological work, while Bresadola had initially trained as a priest before becoming one of the world's experts on fungi. Now, those two career trajectories, while perhaps a bit surprising by present standards of scientific training, were actually not especially uncommon at the time. Before mycology became something like a quasi-independent scientific discipline, many of the early fungal experts were in fact doctors and pharmacists or just well-trained amateurs. Nor was it especially surprising that Lloyd looked outside of America for mycological expertise. The first great mycological botanist in North America, Louis de Schweinitz, was a church administrator who engaged primarily with a European audience for some of his writing. The next generation of American mycologists, including the Reverend Moses Ashley Curtis and the plantation owner and slaver Henry Ravenel, both relied heavily on identifications of their fungi by a British expert, Miles Joseph Berkeley. So there really was a limited degree of American expertise about fungi and mycology until well into the 1800s. And although a number of competent Americans were working in the subject by Lloyd's time, much fundamental research was happening across the Atlantic Ocean. So Patouillard and Bresadola, for example, were working within a mycological universe that had undergone really fundamental transformations beginning in the mid-1800s. Researchers such as Charles and Louis-René Toulaine, who were two French brothers, had begun to use microscopes to detail the minute workings of the fungal world, producing gorgeously detailed renderings of this seemingly alien universe, including the one pictured here. Along with increasingly useful and powerful microscopes, the number of identified fungi was growing dramatically toward the end of the 1800s. The Italian mycologist Pier Andrea Saccardo, who's pictured on your left, would begin to publish in 1882 a monumental undertaking called the Sylloge Fungorum Omnium Hocusque Cognitorum, which, for those of you who aren't up to date on your Latin, means essentially the collection of all presently known fungi. And what Saccardo was trying to do was to list every species that had been identified so far by anyone, anywhere in the world. He thought originally that this might take him about 10 years to do, but the project actually lasted almost a century, long after Saccardo died and long after even his son died, who partly took over the work after Saccardo's death. So this idea of collating all the world's species was very current, but it was especially difficult to carry out in practice. And one of the things that someone like Sicardo really relied on was the emergence of a new institution that many of us more or less take for granted, the Universal Postal Union, which was an international treaty in the late 1800s that established a system of uniform regulations and allowed mail and packages to be sent around the world with far more ease than previously. Letters that were sent from almost anywhere on the planet addressed to P.A. Sicardo in Padova, Italy, were likely to reach him, which was really quite a dramatic change from 40 or 50 years before. This meant that rather than just lists or the beautiful drawings of fungi, such as this one by Émile Boudier, who's widely considered one of the great fungal illustrators, which were the centerpiece of a lot of earlier work, contemporary mycologists in the end of the 1800s were able to exchange recently collected dried specimens with each other across significant distances. Numbered collections of dried fungi, known as exicati, were especially popular because shipping fresh mushrooms through the mail all but guaranteed that they would be destroyed in transit, possibly even eating their packaging along the way. So the image on the left, for example, is an example of an exicata of fungus collected by George Washington Carver. Many people probably know Carver as the Black Leonardo or for his peanut expertise, but few actually remember that he was also a dedicated fungus expert and loved to feed people mushrooms when they came to visit him down in Tuskegee. Now, extensive communication was not in itself a completely novel phenomenon. Back in the mid-1700s, Carl Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, had included species from across the globe in the volumes of his Systema Naturae, many of them collected by colonial agents and explorers who were newly traversing the globe on behalf of European rulers. But by the time of Sicardo, Brassavola, Patouillard, and Lloyd, the speed of international communication had accelerated, and the interest in trying to collect species from across the globe increased dramatically. Thus, Lloyd, for instance, was able to write to Sicardo numerous times, requesting information, as in this letter, about his friend Brassavola, who had lost communication during the violence of World War I. Quick correspondence between Cincinnati, Ohio, and Padova, Italy, would have been almost unimaginable decades earlier, but it's really a kind of evidence of the transformation in communication. But Lloyd had an advantage over many other mycologists of his time when it came to pursuing the study of fungi and sharing his findings. He was independently wealthy and could invest substantial funds into his burgeoning hobby. And I'll just point out that for those of you in Cincinnati, this is a photo of the early Lloyd Library, which the building is now disappeared, but this is where many of Lloyd's collections were first put together. So in 1898, having studied for a number of years, Lloyd self-published a list of volvi species. And in the introduction to this text, he kind of laid out his personal philosophy of collecting specimens. Encouraging others to join him in studying fungi, Lloyd wrote, quote, "You will find many difficulties in your path, but you are needed in this work. And if a number of botanists in different sections will undertake to make a careful study of their local mycological flora, not contenting themselves to be mere collectors of dried specimens, but students in the woods, it will not be many years until we can have a systematic American work of value on the subject." So even in his early works, Lloyd was sort of making a call to arms to other American collectors and mycologists. Now, encouraged by the responses to this initial compilation, Lloyd began to publish his own magazine in 1898 called Mycological Notes. In doing so, he was following more or less a trend of the era for individuals or small groups or clubs to begin publishing mycology-specific periodicals. The first of these, the Revue Mycologique, began publishing in 1879, and it has kind of a fun story that its initial publisher, Casimir Rumeguer, was a sort of Toulouse-based pasta baron who became a mycology addict. And this was followed by periodicals like America's Journal of Mycology, which appeared in 1885. But Lloyd's Mycological Notes was a somewhat unique publication because of his twin commitments to, on the one hand, keeping things accessible and entertaining, and on the other hand, on reaching as many people as he possibly could. Departing from much earlier emphasis on drawing and illustration, Lloyd, who was actually a kind of miserable artist, to be honest, highlighted the value instead of photographs. And he promised to send his high-quality photographic plates at low cost to almost anyone who was willing to write him in Cincinnati. Now, when Mycological Notes first started in 1898, most of those people were in the United States, and somewhat predictably, they were located in the places we might imagine: New York City, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, etc. And just to give you a few examples of the photographs that Lloyd published in 1901, you would have been really hard-pressed to find better mass-disseminated images of fungi at the time. These were exceptionally high-quality images, and you would not have been able to get them almost anywhere else. So initially, Lloyd positioned himself as a kind of intermediary between learned European experts and newly interested Americans. In 1899, he took the first of many international collecting expeditions. He visited Samoa that winter, and in Mycological Notes number 6 in 1901, he published diagnoses of the fungi he collected during that journey, but they were identifications that were sent to him by Patouillat and Brassardella. But that same issue included an explanatory note that Mycological Notes would be sent freely to anyone willing to send specimens to Lloyd, which was a truly unique model, and one that made his publication uniquely accessible to small-scale collectors and amateurs, and would be hugely influential for his future work. At the end of the issue, Lloyd explained that collectors should send him anything, even if it seemed useless or trivial or common. Quote, "Your trouble will be fully appreciated," Lloyd urged. In the next issue, he thanked collectors from California, Iowa, New York, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and more, as well as international collectors in Italy, England, Sweden, France, and Hungary. By issue number 10, Lloyd had to actually condense the list of senders in order to accommodate a huge number of names from virtually every state in the United States and foreign lands like Canada, Jamaica, Ireland, Japan, Belgium, parts of Africa, etc. And you can see this sort of very aesthetically demonstrated. Initially, these are all broken up in individual names, and he has to just kind of slam them all together over multiple pages pretty soon because there's just so much material coming in. And so part of what made Lloyd such an attractive correspondent was his singular willingness to identify collected mushrooms by people of almost any social standing anywhere in the world. He was like a kind of proto-Google or a living mushroom identification app. And if you sent him your specimens carefully numbered, he would return an identified list and even note the areas of uncertainty or perhaps name a new species after you. So here's a couple examples of kind of what this looked like in practice. In this first letter from 1902, Toji Nishida, who was a phytopathologist at the Central Agricultural Experiment Station in Tokyo, thanks Lloyd for identifying a sort of package of specimens he had sent a little bit earlier in the year. In this second letter from 1917, Brazilian botanist Alvaro de Silveira writes enclosing his own package of local fungi. This one's kind of funny, though, because he writes in Portuguese, and Lloyd, who literally could only read French and English, adds at the bottom of this letter, which you can see if you're on your computer, what does he say? Because he couldn't really figure it out. So Lloyd ran into some language issues along the way. In a third letter from 1921, this comes from T.E. Chip, who was a colonial administrator with the forestry department of the Gold Coast. He tells Lloyd that unfortunately he may not be able to send any more specimens as he could in his prior role with the colonial government in Singapore because he's more busy now. And characteristically, Lloyd says, "Oh, that's too bad. and immediately wrote to Chip's replacement in Singapore asking if they would send him specimens instead. He was committed to getting these specimens. And all of these specimens started just pouring in, and it really mounted up. As Lloyd wrote to his friend Henry Beardsley in 1919, "I started in the study of fungi as a fad, but I'm afraid it's going to turn out to be a business." The previous year, in 1918, Lloyd had actually sold his shares in the family pharmacy and dedicated himself entirely to mycological work. It's worth noting that his brothers were surprisingly lenient and supportive of his kind of attention to botany, and John Urry really encouraged Lloyd to dedicate himself to mycology. This transformation was illustrated in this wonderful Christmas card that Lloyd sent out, which highlighted the almost complete transformation of his personality from a wealthy socialite dude in the 1880s who was frequently featured in local newspapers. He was always at the opera and theater, etc., to a kind of worldly pioneering explorer by the early 20th century. And this card is a great example of Lloyd's very kind of active and biting sense of humor, which won him a number of friends, but also a number of enemies who didn't really appreciate the humor that Lloyd brought to scientific work. And as this self-image suggests, Lloyd did not just sit in Cincinnati and wait for fungi to come in. Because he recognized the value of consulting specimens in person, he was very active in traveling the world to meet fungal experts and to visit many of the world's great fungus collections whenever he could. And I think without being so explicit himself, Lloyd recognized the way in which the study of fungi was now fundamentally an international undertaking. It was no longer a kind of minor European project or a local American one, but to be a fungus expert meant traveling the world and meeting people and seeing specimens all over the place. And another thing that added to his own popularity was that Lloyd then reported on many of these travels in a very informal manner in the pages of Mycological Notes, which made the journal a kind of like international travel blog with photographs of a really rare quality, which enabled his readers to do this kind of imaginative travel themselves. Lloyd would talk about people he had met. He would give little details about their personality. He would insult his rivals. It was kind of a fun read, and it helped to increase circulation. And as the mushroom business became more established, Lloyd actually had to open up additional part-time offices for his work internationally. One of these was in Paris, really close to the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, the Museum of Natural History in Paris. The other was pretty much right across the street from the Royal Botanic Gardens in London, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. At these sites, he had local assistants. They were usually young women who he paid a small salary to act as kind of a secretary and correspondent, as well as local booksellers who forwarded his correspondence and purchased texts when needed. And I'll highlight that this is one of the reasons why the Lloyd Library's collections are so unique and spectacular, which is that Lloyd frequently had a direct representative at estate sales of famous botanists in Europe, which was something that few other Americans could imagine doing. So the Lloyd has first editions of many of the classic works in botany and mycology, and it's because Lloyd had representatives kind of all over the place, purchasing almost anything they could for him. And in a time before the internet, this really all positioned Lloyd as an extremely valuable individual. American mycologists, even the ones who didn't really like him that much, asked Lloyd to buy books for them while he was traveling in Europe, and his proximity to international centers allowed Lloyd to directly observe many specimens and correspond with people much more quickly than others could. It was very common in Mycological Notes for Lloyd to say, you know, this person identified a fungus as this, but I've seen the specimen in Paris and I think they're wrong, which was something that a lot of Americans or Europeans couldn't really do for each other's respective collections. And one of the things that's so interesting about Lloyd was that he was almost obsessively interested in acquiring fungal specimens from different countries. In 1915, for instance, he received this letter from Bingwen Zhu, who was a Chinese student studying mycology at Cornell University in New York. Zhu wanted to be added to Lloyd's mailing list to get issues of Mycological Notes. And as Lloyd did with nearly every foreign correspondent, he wrote back immediately with some collecting advice, and he urged Zhu to send him any Chinese fungi he could find. So Lloyd wrote, quote, "The fungi of China are practically unknown because very few plants have ever been collected or sent to museums." So he encouraged Zhu to send him anything he could once he went back to China. And Zhu is a great example of another transformation that was happening in the early 20th century, which was really intelligent researchers coming from Asian, African, Middle Eastern countries and studying in the United States to take knowledge back with them to build up departments of plant pathology, departments of botany, et cetera. And Lloyd really took advantage of these kind of emigre scientists. Not took advantage in a nice way, I should say. Making a kind of similar point to a Japanese correspondent in 1926, Lloyd asserted, quote, "There is no other country where there are so many novelties and endemic species as in Japan, and practically no work was done with them until they began coming into me from many Japanese collectors." And despite the apparent specificity to Japan in this quote in this letter, Lloyd made really similar claims about the novelty of fungi in places such as the Philippines and China and beyond. He was fascinated with all the different fungi that were coming into him. Now, many of these were coming from scientists, but one sort of intriguing and vital part of Lloyd's collecting network was not scientists, but instead a network of clergymen who were spread all around the world. Members of the clergy had free time for natural observation, which was often understood as part of the celebration of God's work. They cared little about their own scientific prestige, and they often offered their services freely, so Lloyd was happy to oblige. The most prominent of these, of course, was Brasadula, but there was also the Brazilian priest mentioned by Rose at the start of my presentation, likely a man named Johann Rick, who was based in the town of Lajeado in Rio Grande do Sul, who frequently sent Lloyd specimens for multiple decades. There was also the Abbé Hubert Bordeaux, who is located in Saint-Priest-en-Murat, which is near Lyon in France. He sent Lloyd all kinds of specimens and local French items that Lloyd couldn't get access to. And even in the United States, there was Father Adeodatus Bouteloup, a priest at the St. Peter's Rectory in Fairmont, West Virginia. And Bouteloup and Lloyd wrote tons of letters back and forth to each other. Bouteloup was particularly valuable to Lloyd because he knew English, Latin, and French. And on a few occasions, Lloyd would have Bouteloup translate sections of his writing from English into French so that he could then pretend to be worldly in the pages of Mycological Notes when he published things in French. It was absolutely a performance because it's quite clear Lloyd could barely write in French. He could read it pretty well. So these priests were really important and the scientists were really important, but I think Lloyd did this other very interesting thing for the scientific community, which is that he helped the international mycological community to kind of visualize its diversity and extent by frequently publishing photographs of mycologists from around the world. So on the left, you see a photo of Atsushi Yasuda, who was the first Japanese mycologist to be included in Mycological Notes. He was one of Lloyd's correspondents. Yasuda's compatriot, Kingo Miyabi, would also feature on the cover of Mycological Notes in 1922. Now, Miyabi actually visited Lloyd in Cincinnati. He was one of the rare folks that Lloyd actually met in person. But it's important to stress that very few of these mycologists in Italy or Britain, United States, Japan, very few of these workers ever saw, let alone met each other. So they just read about themselves in papers and journals and articles, etc. And by publishing these photos, Lloyd helped many people put faces to names and think about the kind of person who was making the identifications that they were reading about, which was surprisingly important. There are some really delightful notes where, for instance, people say, oh, I hadn't seen this man for almost 20 years, even though he was my old teacher. Thank you for publishing his photo. Now, despite all of this, I don't want to sound just totally positive about Lloyd, because it has to be admitted that Lloyd's vision of international mycological collaboration remained a little bit one-sided. In an extended correspondence with a young Indian mycologist named Sahe Rom Bose, who's shown here, in 1919, Lloyd cautioned Bose against trusting his own intuitions about species. He wrote, quote, "It is almost impossible for a local worker to get a correct idea of the species. And the greater part of the species that have been described in the past are, in my opinion, invalid and only add to the confusion." Lloyd saw himself and his friends at Kew in London and a few others as the key experts to whom local researchers elsewhere should listen to and learn from. They should send their specimens and receive their identifications. But Lloyd got a little uncomfortable when people like Bose started to send identifications to him. And it's worth highlighting here that Bose would actually go on to become quite celebrated as a mycologist. He did path-breaking work on the bracket fungi, and he made a lot of important discoveries about the mechanisms of two antibiotics, polysporin and campestrin. So Lloyd's somewhat patronizing response was not entirely heeded in Bose's case. But while insisting to some extent on his centrality, another thing that's quite interesting about Lloyd was one of his sort of key scientific hobby horses, which was a criticism of what Lloyd called advertising in mycology. And what he meant by advertising is that when a mycologist discovered a new species, they would typically describe that species in a journal, publish a list of those species, and they would then be sort of accepted and acknowledged by other researchers, typically noting the name of the individual who made that first description next to the specimen name. Lloyd really hated this practice and wrote about it constantly. He annoyed a lot of his friends by continuously writing about it. And but in Lloyd's sense, botanists were looking at the beauty of the natural world and mostly seeing themselves reflected back. They were kind of projecting themselves and doing a lot of this as a self-aggrandizing project. Now, many people disagreed about this. It should be emphasized. Lloyd even went so far as to invent a character, this Professor McGinty, who's shown here, to whom he would connect some of his own new species identifications. So they would be described as a McGinty species. And this produced a lasting challenge for some subsequent mycologists, because it wasn't always clear if Lloyd meant his new species as a joke or whether he was serious about this new specimen as being real. And I think that a lot of people got sort of riled up about Lloyd's criticisms, but McGinty and Lloyd's criticisms of advertising can be understood, I think, in the light of just an explosion of information about fungi being produced by more and more researchers in places all across the globe. It was really, really hard to keep up with everything that was happening, even if you had all the money and time in the world, like Lloyd sort of did. There was no internet. It was tough to get all the publications. It was tough to view all the specimens. So it was easy to understand why somebody could kind of be critical of the new species names that were coming out sort of all over the place, whether or not he was right. And it should be stressed in a contemporary sense, he was wrong quite frequently. But what's important, I think, is the broader effect of all of this work and exchange, which was, as Rose summarized, that Lloyd assembled together probably the largest dried specimen collection ever produced, at least up to that point, and one that represented a tremendous number of species and places from around the world. Lloyd had really demonstrated the diversity of fungi, even though he thought that mushrooms were often the same in one place or the other. And in doing so, he was only perhaps the most active or one of the most successful of a growing number of international collectors who were seeking to unify the world's disparate species identifications into a more coherent picture of global diversity. And there was, I think, one interesting effect to some of this work in particular, which is that Lloyd, his life also revealed something of a shift in the center of worldwide mycological power, one that I think is symbolized and revealed in this letter from Otto Reinking, who was a professor of plant pathology in the Philippines. Reinking explains to Lloyd in 1919 that the main part of our material, meaning from the Philippines, from the college has been sent to Patuiar in France. However, I believe that this material should all go to the United States. The US was emerging as a world power, as an imperial power in a general sense, and that power was in some ways being reflected in the worlds of plant pathology and in mycology. And the shift from Patuiar, who Lloyd himself had once relied upon almost entirely for his identifications, to shipping things directly to the United States to people like Lloyd, really showed how American empire intersected and sustained and benefited from mycological work, which is, I think, a fascinating issue that many scholars are currently starting to look at. And we live today, in a sense, in the legacy of these transformations. For nearly 100 years, the collections of the United States government have been among the most extensive fungal collections in the world. They're comparable really only to the Royal Botanic Gardens in London. And a significant reason for that is the worldwide collecting efforts of people like Lloyd, whose herbarium formed the foundation of what we now know as the US National Fungus Collections. I think I've seen estimates that it probably doubled the size of the fungus collections when it was first donated. So as mycology became a more explicitly international undertaking, it magnified and intersected with shifting international geopolitics in all kinds of fascinating ways. Before I end, I wanted to share this photo of a beautiful agaric mushroom that I found outside my office a couple weeks ago here in New Jersey. And I wanted to say for the people who are tuning in from Cincinnati that October and mid-October was Curtis's favorite time to look for mushrooms around the area. So I recommend that those of you who are in Cincinnati go out to some forests or parks, and you may be walking in the very same places that Lloyd once did. If you take a trip down to Crittenden, Kentucky, which is, I think, about 40 minutes away, you can also see a wonderful little self-effacing monument that Lloyd made to himself that stresses how he will be quickly forgotten by subsequent researchers. And if you can't do that, if you're scared of the forest, I recommend at least going to visit the wonderful exhibit on mycology at the Lloyd right now, because you will see text and images from many of the researchers and scholars that I talked about in this talk on display in that exhibit. So I hope people can go see it. And with that, I thank you so much for tuning in. I just want to highlight to a couple researchers, undergraduates, who helped me do a little background research for this project. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Brad. That was fascinating. While we're waiting for some chat questions to come in, I have a question for you. And you spoke about Curtis Gates Lloyd's connections with some of the world famous scientists and that sort of thing. But there were also people that weren't world famous, not classically trained citizen scientists that, it's my understanding, also contributed to this collection. Can you talk a little bit about those folks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. And, as I mentioned, that the accessibility of mycological notes meant that it really went to people all over the world and all over the United States. So there were a lot of, just interested amateurs who got kind of fascinated by a mushroom that they saw outside, wanted to know what it was, sent it to Lloyd, he would identify it. And there are numerous people who you can trace from the correspondence that are preserved at the Lloyd, where you can see someone kind of starting out with a little degree of general interest, and over time in their correspondence with Lloyd, becoming more and more of a kind of amateur expert. Many of these were women who were not necessarily scientists, professionally, but really did important work and made, discoveries of new species, made wonderful drawings to illustrate species. They, found diversity of specimens in multiple places. So one of the things that I think is so fascinating about Lloyd's sort of undertaking, his project, his research, was the way that he really assembled this worldwide network of collectors. It was kind of an early citizen science project, although he didn't necessarily see it that way. And this is what enabled the large sort of collection and that he carried out. And it was not just, I don't want it to sound like it was just famous people, because it really was both sort of well-known scholars and really random folks all around the world. And one of the things that I found fascinating while looking through this material is that there were even quite a few people who didn't really care about mushrooms, or they had no interest really in mycology. They kind of just did this because they thought that Lloyd might enjoy it, or it was kind of just a small diversion from their normal jobs, and they would just collect and send things to him. And it, when you think about a project today like Wikipedia, a very crowdsourced knowledge project, I think in some ways Lloyd's collection was kind of an example of this broad crowdsourced knowledge production. And he's not the only one to do it, but he probably had the most extensive network, at least in that time.
So I'll go ahead and jump in with another question, which is obviously Curtis Gates Lloyd was very influential in the identification of fungi. That was sort of almost like a reason to be. Moving forward to a time when he was no longer alive, and so many of the discoveries of late, or the last 50 years or whatever, have been because of DNA. So that huge collection of specimens that he collected that are now at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Library, is DNA research being done on any of those specimens, to your knowledge?
Yes, definitely, or at least it certainly has been done over time. Yeah, I think that in a somewhat simplistic sense, there are a couple real technological transformations that really altered the world of mycology. And right before Lloyd's time, it was improved microscopes that had fixed issues of chromatic aberration, allowed for sort of deeper magnification. These really allowed people to see sort of fungal cells and to look at the kind of microscopic world of fungi. But after Lloyd, you have things like the electron microscope, which allowed people to see into fungal hyphae, which are the sort of tubes that fungus create as they move through the world. And then you have the kind of DNA revolution coming in the 80s and 90s. And it's interesting to think about how some of these, how they kind of both reflected and transformed Lloyd's work. One of Lloyd's kind of adamant insistences was that a fungus that you found in Europe was almost certainly the same fungus that you found in North America. Like if they looked the same, they were probably the same thing. Today, researchers are really changing their opinion about a lot of those questions, precisely because DNA and genomic analysis is allowing for the study of distinct specimens. So like the mushroom I showed at the end, the fly agaric, there are now debates about whether there's a North American fly agaric that's distinct from European fly agaric, and whether these should be different species or not. So the DNA revolution really helped to kind of get deeper into the sense of how mushrooms related to each other, how they evolved, how that transformed in different places, and to even change the ideas about what a fungus is. In Lloyd's time, you would have kind of thought about, for instance, the potato famine was caused by an oomycete called late potato blight. And in Lloyd's time, this would have been thought of as a fungus, but now we know that this is a sort of different kind of entity entirely. It's not in the fungal kingdom. So there were both things that were fungi that were kind of understood to be new things. There were things that were thought to be one thing that were understood to be many. So the DNA revolution really transformed work, but it really did still rely on collecting projects like Lloyd's and like other people's, because it allowed people to look at these dried specimens, test spores, look at samples from different places. And there are new projects today also to try to chart changes in biodiversity with the help of these samples, because if something existed in North Carolina in this year, but we can't find it today, what does that mean about changing trees? What does that mean about changing species? So yeah, it's really important, and it's really fascinating how these discoveries have both built on and kind of transformed each other.
So we have a question from that's asking, were more women involved in mycology relative to botany or other natural sciences? Or are you simply more careful? Are we simply more careful to acknowledge their presence?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have the expertise to say definitively if there were more, sort of in mycology versus other parts of botany. And it's worth also emphasizing that until very recently, mycology was botany because fungi were plants. So, all of these people were, to some extent, they thought of themselves as botanists. But one of the things that I've noticed, and people like Maddie Didi Depankin, whose lecture I mentioned at the start, that mycology was an area where I think there was an opening for people who were kind of non-traditional scholars, or so whether they were women who weren't necessarily allowed to teach, in professional institutions, or just people who were like a little strange. I think mycology's history is so interesting because many mycologists are very quirky people, and looking for mushrooms is a weird thing to do. You're often out after the rain or even in the rain in a forest looking under a tree for little weird things that are buried by leaves. It's kind of a peculiar undertaking, and I think it often attracted sort of somewhat maybe countercultural or people who weren't necessarily a fully mainstream scientists. And one of the things that scholars are really starting to highlight now is that a lot of the work that was kind of thought to be done by men early on was at least partly or perhaps even fully done by female collaborators. So a number of a number of mycologists often sent illustrations that were done by their wives, for instance. And so the wives were the real artists, and the men weren't. And so there are interesting kind of social dimensions there. And it also, I think there was, illustration was often pitched to women, especially in America in the early 20th century, as kind of like a fun, useful hobby to have. And so a lot of the most wonderful illustrations in the US in the 20th century were done by kind of women who took, maybe drawing classes and then started doing watercolors of mushrooms. And these were not just, aesthetic projects. They were very useful for researchers in order to look at, visualize mycological differences. So it's hard to say if there were more or less, but I think it's certainly the case that there were quite a few. And many of the big names in mycology are kind of men. Traditionally, it's like a story of a million fathers. There's Schweinitz is the father of North American mycology. Berkeley is the father of British mycology. There's millions of fathers and grandfathers and all of that. There aren't a lot of mothers of mycology in the classic stories, but there were tons of really influential women. One of Lloyd's best friends, I should say, was one of the heads of mycology at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, Elsie Wakefield. And they had a really fascinating relationship. They were like really close pals. Lloyd said that if he was, if Wakefield was a man, they would have been like best intimate friends. So it's hard to know what to make of that. But there were a lot of very influential female figures in the field, and they were often written out of stories, I think, until more recently.
So Lee is asking, was the distributed crowdsource model of research a distinctive feature of mycological research of the era, or was it true in other areas as well?
Yes, I can always trust my dad to come with a question. Yeah, so again, this is a little hard to say. And in a sense, this kind of network-based collecting and identification existed for almost all of botany and even zoology as well. So, European collectors were sending back specimens of birds and cats and all kinds of things from all over the world to be identified and studied back in the sort of cosmopolitan sites. It was certainly true with flowers, which were collected very broadly and sent back. But I think that one of the things that made mycology somewhat difficult to do at times was that it was very difficult to know when you would find a mushroom. It might show up one place one year in the fall on October 15, but you go back next year, it's not there anymore. And you can't just grow most of these species in a garden as you potentially could with many flowers, and you couldn't raise them in a zoo as you could with certain species of animals. So I think in some ways it required this really distributed network to just get a sense at any moment in time where random people might find different species. And so I think it may not have been unique to mycology, but mycology almost demanded it because it was really difficult as a single individual to possibly collect all of the species that were even in your own area, let alone sort of all across the globe. I think Lloyd was probably uniquely able to travel the globe. He made it to most of Europe. I don't think he ever made it to Japan, but he was certainly he made it to Samoa. He made it to parts of the Asian continent. But very few people could do even that. And so you really had to have this kind of collaborative approach in order to produce knowledge of this kind, and especially to systematize it, because you needed to keep getting examples in order to compare things against each other or say that there were differences.
So I've heard others ask you this question in person, and as someone who began his studies of pigs and dogs, what brought you to mycology? That's from Joan.
Yes. Well, I think I've long been interested as a historian in how we come to know what other living things are. So when we say that we know things about our dogs or about the birds that we see flying outside, how do we know those things, and how did we come to know them? How did we study them? And I think one of the questions that got me very interested in dogs was thinking about our relationship with organisms that we really identify with and that we live with and that we have very emotional relationships with. So we like dogs, and for hundreds of years we've imagined ourselves as dogs. We've used dog metaphors to understand humankind. We often say that our dogs look like us. So there's this very close, intimate relationship between humans and dogs. And in a scientific sense, part of what I was interested in is how do people have those relationships but still justify running an experiment on a dog, for instance, which is often a very difficult thing to do. So how does that kind of intimate closeness relate to the production of knowledge? And with mushrooms, it's kind of the opposite. I think for hundreds of years, people have been confused about mushrooms. They don't know what they are. They don't know why they emerge. For a long time, people thought that mushrooms just spontaneously emerged out of the earth. They didn't know about spores. They didn't know how things spread. So mushrooms have this mysterious kind of otherworldly allure, and they have for a very long time. So I guess part of my own interest was in trying to think about, instead of things that we understand and relate to and sort of have an intimate familiarity with, how do we come to learn and study these things that really resist our sort of overtures and don't necessarily want to live so closely with us, or we don't want to live closely with them one way or the other? So I guess that's the short answer to that question.
So Steve, first of all, compliments you on a fantastic talk. It said, ask, is there a late 20th century, 21st century scientist influenced by Lloyd, meaning someone who followed his process and matches his scope?
In a sense, I think the answer is no. And part of that, of course, is the specialization of scientific fields that we've seen over the last 20th century. So, in Lloyd's time, you could hope to be a mycologist who kind of knows all of the fungi. That was a kind of reasonable thing to imagine doing, that you could just figure them all out and kind of identify them all. And I think today, a PhD student in mycology would laugh at you if you asked, like, do you know every single fungus that exists in the world? That would be impossible. People tend to focus in on particular genus or particular model organism, like particular kinds of yeast in order to do experimentation there. So one part is specialization. I think it's difficult to be someone like Lloyd. Another part is that Lloyd was a really unique individual, so it's almost hard to imagine anyone being quite like Lloyd. He was, on the one hand, really dedicated to mycology. He produced all of this work. He wrote tons of letters. It's kind of amazing to think about just the amount of time he spent dictating to his secretary. It must have just taken all of his time. But he was also a very shy guy. He actually kind of was afraid of meeting some of the well-to-do scholars. He was very much self-taught. He had a real chip on his shoulder about Harvard-educated guys. He really hated a lot of them because he thought they were kind of phony and elite and all of that. So he was a kind of unique combination of like gregarious and shy, self-trained, but also very worldly. And it would be hard to kind of imagine anyone quite like that emerging today, although there are certainly plenty of self-trained scholars. And the kind of de facto suggestion might be somebody like Paul Stamets, who's really done a lot to popularize mycological knowledge. But there's so much difference between Lloyd and Stamets that I wouldn't necessarily compare the two. And one of the funnier things about Lloyd, despite being, he was so interested in collecting all the fungi, et cetera, he just was uninterested completely in eating mushrooms. Like he thought that was the dullest thing in the world. People were always writing him asking, like, can I eat this mushroom that I found in my yard? And he would say, don't, because it's probably dangerous, but also I don't know and I don't care. So he was a paradoxical guy, and it's really hard to think of someone who quite matches his kind of personality and approach.
You mentioned that he wasn't into eating mushrooms, but something you mentioned earlier in the program was if people had puffballs to send to him. I know that he was particularly intrigued with puffballs. Can you speak to that? And for those in the audience that might not know what puffballs are, share that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so Lloyd was really interested in puffballs, which is not really in a contemporary sense, we would say it's not really a distinct group of fungi, but basically it's small mushrooms that create a kind of small ball, and this ball shoots sort of thousands, millions of spores into the air. Lloyd was really interested in these, and he was really interested in what he called phalloid mushrooms, which were basically mushrooms that looked like phalluses. And I'm not, you could psychoanalyze Lloyd a little bit about this. I won't do that necessarily. But one of the things that he really emphasized was that puffballs were quite easy to ship. So the fly agaric mushroom that I showed would be really difficult to ship to somebody else, especially in 1919. But some of the bracket fungi also, so if you've ever seen a tree that has those kind of little shelf fungus growing on it, those were also quite easy to ship. And so Lloyd was also very interested in those, what we would call polypores. He became one of America's kind of polypore experts also. So it was both a kind of intellectual curiosity. He seemed fascinated by puffballs and phalloids. But it was also, I think, a very pragmatic and logistical question that it was difficult to get some things to Cincinnati. So Lloyd really emphasized that you should send the things that will survive on the way there. And this is why he kind of emphasized again and again that don't send him any of the fleshy agaric fungi because they're gonna get ruined. Only send the good stuff.
So I think we'll end with there's a question from Melissa. You've talked about how sort of all of his attention went to mushrooms and fungi. Did Lloyd have a wife or children?
He did not. And I think that historians have had differing views about why this is. One of the things that Lloyd is very clear about in all of his letters, he says this constantly to everybody, is that he doesn't believe in marriage. And that he doesn't believe that men should be kind of held down. So he got in trouble once by writing a little biography of the British mycologist John Ramsbottom, where he kind of says, oh, Ramsbottom's getting married, now he's going to be under the control of his wife. Ramsbottom didn't love that much. But so Lloyd was interesting, and some scholars have thought that he was a bit of a playboy. Maybe he was kind of dating around, and he just didn't want to get sort of tied down. There are some suggestions that maybe Lloyd was gay, and this is, he didn't really have a kind of outlet in order to discuss that. It's not clear. I think someday I would love to write maybe an actual biography of Lloyd and try to figure out the answer to these questions. But really, he dedicated his life to mushrooms. And at the end, there are these very bittersweet letters that he writes to some of his sort of older friends. He used to kind of take out young women to the opera all the time. And he keeps writing to many of them late into his old age. But he never saw most of them ever again, and he actually wasn't very interested in doing so. He dedicated himself to mushrooms, and sort of the advance of mycology kind of was his wife and his children, and he would spend hours and hours at the Lloyd Library. There are stories of people knocking on the door at night and finding him just in there with a coal fireplace burning, trying to identify new mushrooms. So he really had a kind of all-encompassing devotion to that until his eyesight failed, and then he had to stop working.
Well, I think that's a really nice, well, not his eyesight working, but his dedication to mushrooms and mycology and the study is a great note to end on tonight. Brad, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing these stories and your research with our audience. I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us tonight, and also share with everyone that that programs like ours are supported in part by the members of the Lloyd Library. And if you'd like to contribute to programs like this, visit our website at lloydlibrary.org. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Good night.